This is my interview with Helen Pankhurst, great-granddaughter of Emmeline Pankhurst and granddaughter of Sylvia Pankhurst. She's still involved with women's political rights today in Ethiopia, and I hope you enjoy. Hello, Mrs. Pankhurst.
Hi, Shai.
How are you?
Very well, thanks. Well done for doing this.
Thank you. I have some questions I'd like to ask you about your great-grandmother, Emmeline.
Yeah.
So,
Before you start, can you just tell me a bit more about what this is for and why you chose it and so on?
yes, so we're doing a history project for our final year, and it's related to women's resistance in the 20th century, and we are supposed to do a case study on one specific example. So I wanted to be kind of more interested because most of the people were choosing South African examples, and I kind of wanted to branch out, go somewhere else, just to learn about other sides of the world.
Yeah.
So I decided to Emmeline Pankhurst and the Women's Social and Political Union. Yeah.
Okay. Good. Well done.
So we have to do an
Okay.
interview.
By the way, I've got a son who's the same age as you, which is partly why I decided I would spend my Sunday morning doing this, answering your call.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you very much. I appreciate it.
Okay.
Okay. So first question. How influential do you think Emmeline Pankhurst was to the formation of women's voting rights in Britain?
Well, I think she was very influential, but you have to look at it in the wider context. And the wider context is that there had been centuries of an attempt to address the women's political equality issue. Key people were Mary Wollstonecraft, John Stuart Mill, who tried to pass an early bill in Parliament. Then there was the first National Society for Women's Suffrage, with the leader there being Lydia Becker, who, for years had campaigned on the issue together with my great-grandfather, Richard Pankhurst. And then other key people were Millicent Fawcett, who formed the National Union of Women's Suffrage Societies. So, the context is that there had been other people, there'd been a lot going on, quite large numbers in terms of membership. So I think the NUWSS had over 100,000 members. And then onto the scene came Emmeline Pankhurst and the WSPU, and they they ratcheted things up. And so, now 100 years later, I think very few people would know the other names that I've quoted, but a lot of people would know the Emmeline Pankhurst. She's become the symbol, the icon, I think, of the women's voting rights issue.
Yeah. What do you think Emmeline's greatest action in her involvement in the Women's Social and Political Union was?
I think choosing a single action is quite difficult, but I would say that the formation of a movement for women by women with the issue of agency, it wasn't, it was a much more, a much clearer organization in terms of having a strong target and saying enough is enough. So I think that formation of that movement was incredibly important. Her speeches, the power of her speeches was apparently really important, with key words. We are here not to be law breakers, but to be law makers, etc. She was quite a galvanizing character. And then I think really important is the fact that she didn't do it alone. She did it with her daughters, in particular with Christabel and Emmeline. So I think, as a matriarch, with those two critical components of what the movement became, in other words, I think what I'm saying is that on her own, she wouldn't have been as successful as with the other two. And it was that the strength of the WSPU was partly in that family, not just in her.
Yeah, the entire family was very political, which is quite amazing.
Yeah.
Okay, do you think her militant strategies helped or hindered the progress of her movements, and why?
That's a very difficult question to answer, and I think personally I'm not too sure. I think the context is that there was a ratcheting up of militancy both by the government and by them. So, they tried to speak up in meetings, and they were thrown out. They tried all sorts of democratic methods, but as these became blocked time and time and time again, they became more and more militant. And I think it's understandable and possibly inevitable. You either give up or you, well, there'll be three options. You give up, you continue the long road, or you return the ball. So everything that gets volleyed at you, you volley back with increasingly innovative and daring tactics. And I think to focus only on the militancy is in a way to do a disservice to the movement that I think can be defined by uh, the wacky, the very interesting, the very innovative, the bizarre ways that they ended up making their mark. And I think it's also important that it's individuals who made those decisions. So everything that was done was not done necessarily within a leadership structure where anything was checked and agreed by um, the Pankhursts and the other leaders. It was very much individual tried something, and then if it got media attention, then others did it, and it became something that was endorsed by the movement. I mean, overall, I think that a lot of people felt within the movement felt very uncomfortable with the level of militancy, would have preferred other more democratic approaches, including Sylvia. It was one of the reasons why she was expelled from the movement by her mother and sister, was that she was clearly not comfortable with the level of militancy. Personally, I think my views are probably closer to Sylvia's than they are to Emmeline and Christabel. So I think overall, maybe some of the democratic and bizarre things that they did without so much militancy would have been better. But the fact is that they had the courage to do all of the things that they did, and that it was part of the success story.
Yeah, so you can kind of contrast them to the National Union of Women's Suffrage Societies, where they were more they would use more diplomacy and through lobbying and stuff.
Yeah.
Okay, just how far did the actions of the WSPU go?
Well, as said earlier, it ratcheted up. So they started with disrupting meetings, leaflets, getting media attention, breaking the law in whatever way they could in order to be tried and be able to make their statements in a court of law. Primarily, it was a willingness to be submitted to violence on themselves rather than violence to others. So it was very clearly about not being violent to other people. There was the census boycott in 1911. The destruction of property, window smashing was what they were most well known for, but they looked at all sorts of other ways of identifying the establishment and then attacking it one way or another. So works of art which represented male privilege, or golf courses, again, a bastion of male power, male networking. The disfiguring of coins, which is an act of vandalism because you're disfiguring the figure, a currency, which is a property of the realm, and they would put votes for women on the coins. But I think fundamentally how far they went was a willingness to put their lives on the line, hence the hunger striking and hence the deaths, both well known and less well known. The best known being that of Emily Whirling Davidson, who either threw herself under the King's Horse, or, as is currently generally perceived to be the better interpretation, that she was trying to put the sash on the horse and was willing to put her life on the line, and did so. It wasn't aimed as a direct suicide, but she was willing to do anything for the cause.
Yeah, absolutely. How big was the contribution to the Great War by the women's suffragettes, and do you think that they contributed to the success of the war?
I think symbolically their willingness to stop the internal war, and to rally behind the government and the troops, symbolically was very important, not in terms of the success of the war, but in terms of saying we're all in here together. And the government was very keen on that support and paid them for it, and in terms of helping with the recruitment. Again, this wasn't the whole of the Pankhurst family. Sylvia, my grandmother, was very much against it. She thought it was a senseless war, and that people who would suffer from it were poor working class men and women. And she continued to campaign for women's rights and for equal franchise, because at the time working men didn't have the vote either, and in many other ways continued the battle. So how big was the contribution? I think that the fact that women then took up the roles that men had before, and I think you have a question. Yeah, I'll stop there. I think they contributed, but I wouldn't say that they contributed to the success. It feels too linear to say that.
Okay. Do you think Emmeline's endorsement of the Great War contributions influenced the creation of the Representation of the People's Act in 1918?
I think the argument had been won. So the endorsement of the war helped make it easier for the establishment to introduce the act. But no, I don't think that it was her endorsement of the war, nor the role of women in taking up the work of men in the factories, which actually led to the act being passed. I think it was the fact that the general view of the population had changed, and of the establishment had changed, and a few people who were unwilling to change, such as Asquith, were finally changed their mind, partly by the delegation of working women that eventually he agreed to meet after the work that Sylvia had been involved in. So the system had changed, and the reason why I don't think it's the involvement of women in the war is that if you look at who got the right to vote, it wasn't the young women, i.e. the young women who had taken up the work in the ammunition factories, etc. It was older women. So for me, it was very much that things had changed, and finally, the government agreed to get this act through. Remember also, if you look globally, by then so many other countries had also allowed women to get the vote.
Yeah, I want to ask, how do you think that the suffrage organizations of Britain compared to that of the US?
I think they were very much influenced. So if you look at key characters like Alice Paul and Lucy Burns, who were the ones who founded the National Women's Party, they were both directly influenced by the suffragettes. Alice Paul was a suffragette. She'd been involved in the UK, and also so I think there's a direct link, and very much they talk about that direct link. However, I think it was more complicated as seen in the US, in that you've got the national versus the different states, and different decisions about how to campaign, and also other women's rights activities such as the birth control movement happened at the same time. So you have people like Ethel Byrne, who was the sister of Margaret Sanger, who undertook hunger striking, again influenced by the suffragettes, and they were pushing for birth control at the same time. So a much more multi-pronged feminist movement, I think, at the time. Whereas in the UK, the single media-dominated issue was the Votes for Women one.
Okay, thank you. The WSPU was primarily composed of middle to upper class women. Do you think that this partially skewed the influence of the upper class on the organization?
I think the WSPU actually was more democratic than almost any other institution and organization of the time. So what you have to look at is the fact that at the time you had a class-ridden society. So yes, the WSPU's leaders were primarily middle and upper class, though not exclusively, and the not exclusively was an exception to what was happening in other organisations. And then you have the incidents such as Constance Lytton, who was an aristocrat who was treated in one way and then cut her hair, dressed up as a working class woman called Jane somebody, I can't remember. So she called herself something else, Jane Wardle, I think. And the media treated her very, very differently when she did that. And so the WSPU exposed the society's double standards when it came to class consideration. So in many ways, I think the WSPU represented very much the opposite of a class-ridden structure. And though it still was unequal, some of the work, such as Sylvia's in terms of working in the East End of London, so some people wanted to make it even more democratic, such as Sylvia. So I think it was part of the social change that was happening at the time. And by 1918, because of the war, and even before then, society had started to become more equal in any case. And I think that the suffragettes are part of that movement of social change.
Okay. What did Emmeline do outside of her political activism?
So before she founded the WSPU, she had been involved in social reform issues. I think even before she married Richard Pankhurst, the family was middle class, social reform interested family. So she had been interested in those issues, and then after his death, before the foundation of WSPU, she was a registrar of birth and death. Um, which made her aware of the issue of illegitimacy and the treatment of the treatment of illegitimate children and their mothers in particular when fathers didn't acknowledge their children. And then possibly linked to that interest early on, after she stopped campaigning for the war, or even during that time, she adopted some war babies, 4 war babies, I believe, and was involved in a nursery. And then, of course, she didn't stop the political activism in that she stood for Parliament before she died.
Okay. Are there any memories or insight passed on from Emmeline or Sylvia within the family?
Sylvia a lot. So I'm actually taking this Skype call from Addis Ababa, where I'm living in the house that Sylvia and her son Richard, my father, moved to, and I'm literally in her bedroom. That's my bedroom now. So her influence is still all around us, and it's around me in particular because of all the work that I've done. So my work has always been on women's rights and development issues, and she became interested in Ethiopia. She moved to Ethiopia. She's buried here. So lots and lots of memories around her. And you will have noticed in my responses that I bring her up because I think that her approach was always a little bit different, much more like Richard Pankhurst's, her father, than they were similar to Emmeline and Christabel, because Emmeline and Christabel became more and more right wing and hence standing for Parliament under a Conservative banner, whereas Sylvia was much more left wing. Insights or memoirs from Emmeline. Not really. I mean, just I suppose this tremendous sense that the individuals can make a difference, and always feeling that you have to stand up for inequalities and make a difference where you can.
Okay, those are all the questions I have for you. Thank you very much for your help.
That's a pleasure, Shai. Good luck with the report and with the rest of your career.
Thank you very much, and I wish you well, and good luck for you too.
Okay, thanks so much.
Bye-bye.
Bye.